Welcome to Philosophy 2230. This is the video lecture for April 14th class. Today's reading will be Immanuel Kant's Fundamental Principles of the Metaphysics of Morals. This is an excerpt from a longer work. Kant is a difficult thinker, not the easiest writer in the world, and it's going to take all we can give to try to get through this and make it intelligible in the short time that we have together today. Let's begin. I'm going to use the handout, the study guide that I've provided for this reading on Blackboard. I'm going to use that to guide our discussion of the text here today in this lecture. So, just as in the study guide, let's begin with the very first paragraph on page 297 on to page 298. Here are Kant's words: "Whereas reason is not competent to guide the will with certainty in regard to its objects and the satisfaction of all our wants, which it to some extent even multiplies, this being an end to which an implanted instinct would have led with much greater certainty." We're not going to unpack Kant's complicated thought here about mental faculties and how the will works with reason and all the rest. At least let's give ourselves a little bit of time here and get to the heart of what he's talking about. "Since, nevertheless, reason is imparted to us as a practical faculty, that is, as one which is to have an influence on the will, therefore, admitting that nature generally in the distribution of her capacities has adapted the means to the end, its true destination must be to produce a will, not merely good as a means to something else, but good in itself." So nature's true destination here with the human being is the production of a good will, a will that is good in itself, for which reason was absolutely necessary. Reason allows us to shape our will such that we have good intentions, genuinely good ones. "This will then, though not indeed the sole and complete good, must be the supreme good and the condition of every other good, even of the desire of happiness. Under these circumstances, there is nothing inconsistent with the wisdom of nature in the fact that the cultivation of the reason, which is requisite for the first and unconditional purpose, does in many ways interfere, at least in this life, with the attainment of the second, which is always conditional, namely happiness." He's really, this is a convoluted way of saying that reason, which is necessary and required for the formation of a will genuinely good in itself, does in many ways interfere, at least in this life. So the idea here is the cultivation of a good will in this life, right, at least in this life, as Kant says on top of 298, interferes with the attainment of happiness. Nay, it may even reduce it to nothing. That is, the attainment of happiness may be reduced to nothing, right, without nature thereby failing of her purpose, right? We could think here, honestly, I don't think Kant has this in mind, but we could think here of Socrates, right, who has cultivated his reason, who has a will genuinely good in itself and simply wants to remedy his own ignorance and that of others. Doesn't this interfere with the attainment of happiness? Right, he ends his life in a prison cell being poisoned. Right, but all he can do, and he doesn't leave the cell, and he willingly takes the poison, takes his punishment. Right, all he can do is do the right thing for the right reasons, and if he's meant to be happy in this, at least in this life, right, at least in this life, well, that's something that is ultimately going to be beyond his power, though he does speculate that he'll be happier in the next life. Okay, for reason recognizes the establishment of a good will as its highest practical destination, and in attaining this purpose is capable only of a satisfaction of its own proper kind, namely, that from the attainment of an end, which end again, so this end itself is determined by reason only, notwithstanding that this may involve many a disappointment to the ends of inclination. So we're getting the sort of outlines here of Kant's conception of obeying duty as reason reveals it to us, regardless of our feelings and our sort of attempts to realize happiness in our lives, right? Why do I have to stop at this stop sign? At a four-way stop, nobody else is around, and I'm trying to get somewhere quickly, right? But reason compels me to obey the law because it's the law. And that means I'll be a few minutes late because I had to stop at a stop sign even though nobody was within sight in any direction. Something like that. I'm trying to give you an example here. All right, so let's keep going. I want you to think here, what is a goodwill according to Kant? Why does Kant claim that the goal of reason is to produce a goodwill rather than happiness? Why do you think, right? He would say that reason can only and should only really aim at the production of a goodwill rather than the realization of happiness. All right, on the bottom of page 298, top of page 299, Kant goes on to identify a problem with determining whether someone is acting from duty or from selfish inclination, and right. So there can be a problem here, right? Understanding a person's motivations and intentions. Kant, however, provides us with a helpful example here for illustration of this problem. So if nothing else, we can at least understand what he's getting at here. And I want us to think what his example shows us. All right, so the bottom of page 298. Let's have a look at this passage here, huh? This example in particular. Okay, let's go. 298. I omit here all actions which are already recognized as inconsistent with duty, although they may be useful for this or that purpose. For with these, the question whether they are done from duty cannot arise at all. I mean, clearly, right? When you do something inconsistent with your duty, it may be useful. I don't stop at the stop sign. I get somewhere a few minutes faster, or a minute faster, a few seconds faster. I'm not late to work, right? Useful for me getting somewhere on time. However, the question whether or not my blowing through that stop sign was done from duty cannot even arise at all, can it? Since such an action would conflict with duty. All right. I also set aside those actions which really, I'm using traffic examples just to find something very simple with which to illustrate the essence of what Kant is talking about here. Make it as simple as I can, and then we'll see how difficult it might become. It might be more complicated. We'll see. I also set aside those actions which really conform to duty, but to which men have no direct inclination, performing them because they are impelled thereto by some other inclination. Okay, well, let's set those aside. Actions which conform to duty, but which we have no real inclination to do, we do them. Why? Because we are impelled to by some other inclination. So we have an inclination. However, to satisfy that inclination, a direct route, for whatever reason, is not given to us. And so, right, we perform an action, right, impelled by another inclination. We have an indirect sort of inclination here, okay? And yet the action also conforms to duty. All right, for in this case, we can readily distinguish whether the action which agrees with duty is done from duty or from a selfish view. Okay, it is much harder to make this, so he's going to give us an example in a second, and thank God for that. It's much harder to make this distinction when the action accords with duty, and the subject has, besides, a direct inclination to it. So when an action is both in accordance with duty and we have a personal, individual, physical, natural, embodied inclination or something like this towards that action as well, what he's getting at is it becomes hard to know exactly why we're doing it. For example, here's his example towards the bottom of page 298. It is always a matter of duty that a dealer, a merchant of some kind, should not overcharge an inexperienced purchaser. This is a matter of duty. Do not cheat the customer. And wherever there is much commerce, the prudent tradesman does not overcharge, right? To damage the tradesman reputation. Well, I'm already thinking of it in consequentialist terms, right? So consequentially, you can understand it as by overcharging, any inexperienced customer, right, I run the risk of ruining my business's reputation. So there's a consequentialist reason not to do it. Kant's reasoning here, though, is, look, it is just a principle, right? As an honest broker, dealer, merchant, you, um, every customer pays the same price or something like this. We don't overcharge certain people for being inexperienced. Men are thus honestly served, right? This is why you do it. It's the right thing to do. I am honest, and the customer receives an honest transaction. But this is not enough to make us believe that the tradesman has so acted from duty and from principles of honesty. Good. Now Kant's going to come back around to the reason I started with, right? This reason, this consequentialist reason, it is to my own advantage to build a good reputation by conducting honest transactions with all my customers. His own advantage required this honesty, Kant says. It is out of the question in this case to suppose that he might besides have a distinct inclination in favor of the buyers, so that, as it were, from love he should give no advantage to one over another. Right? In other words, we can't imagine a merchant so, sort of filled with love for all his customers that he, out of love, um, out of love for the customers, treats them fairly. Accordingly, Kant says on the top of 299, how the action was done neither from duty nor from direct inclination, but merely with a selfish view. On the other hand, so now what is he going to go on to here? He's going to give us another example on the top of 299 to clarify what he means by acting from duty. And this one, I think, this example in 299 makes things fairly clear, even though it's a somber example. On the other hand, it is a duty to maintain one's life. Kant will give reasons for this elsewhere, but it is a duty, he says here, to maintain one's life. And in addition, everyone also has a direct inclination to do so. So we all have an inclination to preserve our lives, and Kant says, oh, by the way, when we think about our lives reasonably, we have a duty to continue to live them as long as we can, and as well as we can. Life is a sort of gift, even though Kant is not going to be explicitly religious here. He's almost giving us a secular version of the Christian conception of life as God's gift to human beings. Kant has a sort of secularized, quasi-religious view here that accords with that principle. So it is a duty to maintain one's life. In addition, everyone has a direct inclination to do so. But on this, so we have both the duty to maintain our life, we also have a natural inclination to maintain and preserve our lives. On this account, the often anxious care which most men take for it, the preservation of life, has no intrinsic worth, and their maxim has no moral import. They preserve their life as duty requires. So it turns out, right, preserving your life is in accordance with your rational duty, he says. But they're not preserving their lives because duty requires it. So in most cases, people, kind of saying, are preserving their lives, maintaining their lives, because they have a direct natural inclination to do so, and not because duty requires it. Now we can, let's continue through here and see what Kant's next point is going to be. On the other hand, if adversity and hopeless sorrow have completely taken away the relish for life, right, the natural inclination now to maintain your life is gone. If the unfortunate one, strong in mind, indignant at his fate, rather than desponding or dejected, wishes for death, so the natural inclination is there. I wish that my life was over because it's been so hard, because I've lost so much, right? So the inclination now is to end one's life. But he says, and yet the person preserves his life without loving it, not from inclination or fear. I'm not worried, right? I'm not scared of ending my life, right? However, right, what I am frightened of is disobeying my rational duty to remain alive. Then the maxim has moral worth. Okay, so I want you to think what this example is attempting to illustrate here in 299, top of 299. Trying to determine the basis for action and why it matters to Kant, right, to do something because duty requires, as he puts it here on the top of 299. Not as duty requires, but in accordance with the natural impulse. Anyone can do that. However, he says, doing it because duty requires it is what gives the action moral worth. Okay, so good. I give you some. I have this quoted here in the study guide, and give you a little gloss on it. Let's move now to these propositions on page 299 that I'd like us to pay attention to. And I want to look in particular at the second and third propositions here. Second proposition, that an action done from duty derives its moral worth not from the purpose which is to be attained by it, but from the maxim by which it is determined, and therefore does not depend on the realization of the object of the action, but merely on the principle of volition by which the action has taken place without regard to any object of desire. So what he's getting at here is an action done from duty is a moral action, is the right thing to do, not by reference to the goal we are trying to achieve, but instead the moral worth is determined by whether or not, and to the extent to which the maxim has been determined merely on the principle of volition by which the action has taken place without regard to any object of desire. In other words, what he's kind of getting at here is an action done from duty is an action that you have thought carefully about and realized is the right thing for you or anyone in this position to do. And that by doing this, you are behaving in a way consistent with the actions and behaviors of others who would be in this situation as well. Not from the purpose. In other words, the ends don't justify the means. I mean, that's one way to put his point here. This is arguing the opposite point, in a sense, right? The means justify the end. He's not so much concerned with the ends out of our control, I think, is what he's ultimately getting at. But, why we choose to do something is what really matters. Why are we doing this? Not what do we hope to achieve. The third proposition, towards the very bottom here of 299, is as follows. Third proposition, which is a consequence of the two preceding ones, I would express thus: duty is the necessity of acting from respect for the law. So, another way to put the same point. What Kant is calling duty here is, respecting the law and treating the law as a necessity, as something that necessarily compels us to action in accordance with it. Now, as I say here in the study guide, I want to be clear. Law, as Kant uses it, does not mean a law that has been passed by a legislature or ruled on by a judge, though you can, I think, where those laws do make sense in accordance with reason, you can cite those laws, right? So I use traffic laws sometimes as an example of this. But really what Kant's talking about here by law is a universal principle that guides our action and which allows us to form maxims for our practical actions. We have a principle, right? Principle like, it is never right to lie. I should always be honest. There's a principle. Now I then formulate maxims for practical action. Here I am in this situation, and a police officer is asking if I know why he pulled me over. I could just pretend like I have no idea and act surprised, or I could, for instance, formulate a maxim for my practical action. My principle is that I should always be honest. I realized I was driving 15 or 20 miles over the speed limit, and then I just, according to Kant, right, should formulate the maxim that I, when questioned by an officer in this kind of a situation, tell him the truth, tell him what you did. Okay, officer, you caught me. I was going 15 miles over the speed limit. Something like that. So, I want you to think of an example, right? What would you say here with these propositions? How would you illustrate them, right? Can you think of a case where your duty is the necessity of acting from respect for the law? Can you think of a single law, whether it's a sort of positive law in our legal code, or just a sort of principle? Can you think of a single one that would require you to necessarily act in accordance with it? Do you have principles like that? and you think of examples, right? If I am able to help another in need without harming myself, I should do that, right? And then every single time you're in a situation like that, right, you'll have the maxim, help if I can, right? But you have to think about the particulars of that situation. Okay, let's keep moving. Okay, and I give you some examples here, and I think the second page of the handout. Now let's move to the study guide. Let's move to the middle of the second page of the study guide, where Kant formulates his categorical imperative, the underlying principle for moral action. Here's an example, right, of a sort of universal law that is about as basic as it gets for Kant, and that everybody, here's a law everybody is obligated to obey. So, let's read the quote from Kant. What sort of law can that be, the conception of which must determine the will, even without paying any regard to the effect expected from it, in order that this will may be called good absolutely and without qualification? As I have deprived the will of every impulse which could arise to it from obedience to any law, there remains nothing but the universal conformity of its actions to law in general, which alone is to serve the will as a principle. That is, I am never to act otherwise than that I could also will that my maxim should become a universal law. So, one thing this doesn't mean, and I need to clarify this immediately, right? It doesn't mean that I get to decide what a universal law is simply by virtue of what my will could, affirm, right? It's not the case that if I affirm that this action I am taking, proposing to take, in the court, undertaking right now, I don't get to simply say, right, okay, I'm doing this, and I'm fine with everybody else doing it too. So, that's not how this works, right? You can imagine, for instance, a thief caught stealing, saying something to the effect of, well, you caught me, and you win some, you lose some, right? I've gotten away with stealing most of the time, but you caught me this time, fine. Good luck catching me the next time. Something like that, right? I affirm that people should steal whatever they can carry away and get away with. Go ahead and try to steal from me. I'm going to steal from you, right? That can't work, ultimately, for Kant. Simply because you would affirm it willfully is not alone going to be what's good here. What is it that allows your maxim, my maxim, anyone's maxim to become a universal law? Well, consistency ultimately is going to be the criterion here. So, I'll use the example of lying, right? For example, if I'm a liar, I might think to myself, sure, let everyone lie when they wish. I'm happy to take my chances doing the same. However, if everyone lied, and this is how Kant's going to think about the consistency here, if everyone lied to everyone else on a regular basis, no one would be able to have any kind of reliable communication. And this means lies themselves would no longer be effective. In other words, a liar depends on the general expectation of honesty in our speech with others, and then violates that norm, makes him, her, or themselves into an exception to the general rule. So there's a making yourself an exception to a general rule. And that kind of inconsistency is exactly what is supposed to show us that an action we are proposing to undertake is not in accordance with morality. So I want everybody else to stop at the stop sign, and I want to blow through it. I want everybody else to drive the speed limit, I want to speed past them. So now Kant goes on to argue on page 300 then following this, that even if moral action on the basis of the categorical imperative has been rare or non-existent at this point, so he's anticipating an objection here. You might say, well, wonderful, Kant. It sounds like a beautiful idea, and yet it's hard to think of people doing the right thing simply because it's the right thing, irrespective of consequences. Somebody like maybe Socrates or Jesus or something can sometimes exemplify this, but this is rare or non-existent practically, with the exception of these saints and sages. Well, he goes on to argue that that would be no reason to doubt that it is the true basis for moral action. excuse me. With that interruption out of the way, where were we? Even if moral action on the basis of the categorical imperative has been rare or non-existent to this point, that is no reason to doubt that it is the true basis for moral action according to Kant. Why not? What does Kant mean when he claims that such a moral law, right, never lie, for instance, is valid not merely for human beings but for all rational creatures generally? Boy, that's an interesting claim. It seems to be saying that even alien beings from another dimension, from a faraway planet, would also have to conform to this kind of a principle as rational beings. I think what he's getting at too is this is bigger than just what is right for a human being to do to another human being, but concerns all rational beings. The divine, if the divine exists, other rational beings, whether they be rational animals on the earth or rational beings from any conceivable place in the universe. He's simply talking about sort of the rules of reason in general. So let's have a look at this. 300. Here we go. Without being an enemy of virtue, right? Somebody, a cool observer, somebody who's just claiming to sort of look at the facts and look at history. One that does not mistake the wish for good, however lively, for its reality. This observer may sometimes doubt whether true virtue is actually found anywhere in the world. And this especially as years increase and the judgment is partly made wiser by experience. We sort of see behind the curtain a little bit. Partly also being more acute in observation. This being so, nothing can secure us from falling away altogether from our idea of duty or maintain in the soul a well-grounded respect for its law, but the clear conviction. So experience, good God, empirical experience will not help convince us that moral action on the basis of the categorical imperative is a sound basis for morality. Experience will show us, to the contrary, plenty of evidence of people behaving mostly in accordance with their natural inclinations and violating their duty arbitrarily and frequently. So, what are we to do? We don't want to become nihilists and just give up on the hope that people can do the right thing for the right reasons. This being so, nothing can secure us, nothing can sort of prevent us from falling away altogether from our ideas of duty or maintaining the soul, respect for law, but the clear conviction that although there should never have been actions which really sprang from such pure sources, even if there had never been such actions, right? Even if Socrates, Jesus, and any saint or sage you care to imagine had never even lived and never left behind evidence or testimony of sacrificing every sort of natural inclination for the sake of duty. So even if there never should have been actions which really sprang from such pure sources, yet whether this or that takes place is not at all the question. But that reason of itself, independent on all experience, ordains what ought to take place, that accordingly actions of which perhaps the world has hitherto never given an example, the feasibility even of which might be very much doubted by one who founds everything on experience, are nevertheless inflexibly commanded by reason. What he's getting at here is even if no one has ever acted simply in accordance with duty and not from natural inclination, even if that's true, that doesn't matter, because human beings are capable of acting this way. And so it doesn't matter if they haven't acted this way yet. They are capable of acting this way, and therefore all of past experience, all that shows us maybe is a history of errors. Right? It's kind of like, humans weren't able to fly for most of history. And that doesn't mean that humans cannot fly today. I think that's what he's getting at. We have the potential to do this. And therefore, the fact that it has not happened in history yet, even if we were to grant that fact, that would not tell against Kant's hypothesis here. For example, he says, even though there might never yet have been a sincere friend, yet not a whit the less is pure sincerity and friendship required of every man, right? Because prior to all experience, this duty is involved as duty in the idea of a reason determining the will by a priori principles. Let's not get too much into that, but the idea is something like this. The possibility to be a sincere friend is something humans can realize as rational beings. Whether or not they've actually realized this ever in the past doesn't mean they can't realize it in the future. Okay, let's keep moving. On pages 301 to 302, I don't want to drag this on too long. Pages 301 to 302, Kant restates the categorical imperative and then provides a series of examples to illustrate how it works. As you read his 4 examples, I want you to see whether or not you can identify any problems with his reasoning or anything important that he leaves out. Because these examples, right, they're intended to clarify how Kant's categorical imperative can be applied to experiences in our everyday life, helping us to form maxims that guide us so that we act in a consistent and universalizable manner. So look at these examples, and in particular, I want you to look at examples 1 and 1 and 4 in particular. And I want you to think here. For instance, we'll just read 1 together, okay? I'll let you read the others on your own. But let's look at 1. We've already, he's returning to a point he had just, made a page or 2 earlier. A man reduced to despair by a series of misfortunes feels wearied of life, right? All natural inclination to preserve my life is gone now, right? I've lost everything. I've had all my hopes and wishes crushed. However, this man is still so far in possession of his reason that he can ask himself whether it would not be contrary to his duty to himself take his own life. So even though everything in my life is terrible, lost my job, lost my partner, lost my family, lost this, that, and the other thing, I'm having a really bad week or something like this, everything that could go wrong has gone wrong, and now I'm wondering why I should even go on living, right? Well, here's why. Would it not be contrary to duty to take my own life? Now he inquires whether the maxim of his action could become a universal law of nature. So here would the maxim be, right? Let's think about this maxim. From self-love, I adopt it as a principle. So this is, a person really feeling down, dealing with a lot of adversity, and trying to formulate this principle, right? What if things get too tough and I've lost everything? Can I not justify taking my own life, ending my life prematurely? So here's how you would try to think this through, and Kant's going to identify an inconsistency here that shows duty compels us to maintain our lives. From self-love, right, because I care about myself, my feelings, it hurts to lose things and to be frustrated, right? From self-love, I adopt it as a principle to shorten my life when its longer duration is likely to bring more evil than satisfaction. How you can ever sort of reasonably carry out that calculation is, I think, something to question. Right, just because you had a bad week, a bad month, a bad year, there's nothing in that necessitates that the rest of your life must be just as bad or worse. It is asked then simply whether this principle, founded on self-love, can become a universal law of nature. Now we see at once that a system of nature of which it should be a law to destroy life by means of the very feeling, self-love, whose special nature is to impel the improvement of life, would contradict itself, and therefore could not exist as a system of nature. In other words, what if every creature, anytime it felt frustrated and disappointed, took its life? Could species reproduce themselves? Could nature carry on? Something like this. And so, the feeling of self-love, which is supposed to help us preserve our lives and improve our lives, right, if it became the means to justify ending our lives. What he's saying is we would have a contradiction. This feeling of self-love, really what it's telling me is, the things I am disappointed about are things that I should be actively trying to realize, right? So if I've suffered loss, I should be trying to grieve that loss and then perhaps overcome it in some sense. Instead, right, I want to take that very feeling, concern for myself and for how I feel, and use that feeling to justify ending my life. He's getting at a basic contradiction here, the contradiction between self-love and the ending of our existence. And he's saying this kind of a contradiction, were universally, were we to universally posited as a principle that any creature, any being could end its life, when its self-love is telling it, right, that a longer duration of life will bring more evil than satisfaction, well, we would essentially have a system of nature that could not maintain itself. Hence, that maxim cannot possibly exist as a universal law of nature. Consequently, it would be wholly inconsistent with the supreme principle of all duty. So, I'm not going to unpack this too much. You could have an entire semester-long course on Kant's thoughts about suicide and our duty here. I just want us to wrap our head around how these examples, right, are supposed to illustrate the attempt to think about why we're doing what we're doing and ask ourselves, right, what if everyone did this? Is this a world that could carry on? Is this a situation that could be consistently maintained if everyone were to act as I am acting now, or proposing to act now? And if everyone were to end their lives every time they felt disappointed, frustrated, and that their future was bleak, right? What Kant is saying is, boy, I don't think nature could continue, right? So disappointments, frustrations, loss are a part of life. Okay, let's keep going. Kant provides yet another formulation, and we're going to wrap things up here shortly. He provides yet another formulation of the categorical imperative on the top of page 304. So let's look at this one. And this is in italics on the top of 304. So act as to treat humanity, whether in thine own person or in that of any other, in every case as an end withal, never as a means only. I want us to note the significance of the only here. It's not that we can't treat others as a means at all, right? Someone working a cash register at a store is a means by which I, as a customer, am able to purchase goods and bring them home. You get into an Uber or a Lyft or a taxi, right? That person, that driver, is a means for you to get from point A to point B, aren't they? But what Kant is saying here is the right thing to do in our actions towards others is to respect their humanity and to recognize they are an end and not merely a means. They are an end also. So that taxi driver, that person working the cash register, they have dignity. They have reason. They are living a life and trying to accomplish things and be happy too. And even if they are a means for you to do something like purchase goods at a store and bring them home, or take a ride from point A to point B, what he's saying is you should never treat a person as only a means and not an end in themselves. When you do that, you violate their dignity and their humanity. And again, you could think, right? What if everyone were to treat everyone else as merely a means to their ends and nothing else? We'd have a world in which all relationships were entirely transactional. And, again, Kant would have to explain to us why ultimately that would be completely inconsistent with our rational nature. For one thing, it would involve denying the dignity and reason of others and only sort of recognizing our own dignity and reason. So again, we'd be making ourselves a sort of special exception to a general rule. Everyone's a means to my end, but I alone am an end and not a means for anyone else. Something like that. So in closing, I want us to look at Kant's remarks on autonomy on page 305. Let's read this quote together. What then is it which justifies virtue or the morally good disposition in making such lofty claims? It is nothing less than the privilege it secures to the rational being of participating in the giving of universal laws by which it qualifies him to be a member of a possible kingdom of ends. A privilege to which he was already destined by his own nature as being an end in himself, and on that account legislating in the kingdom of ends. And this is almost Kant's way of saying you have to be the difference that you imagine happening in the world, basically, right? Maybe nobody's ever been a sincere friend. Kant's saying, you be one. You be a sincere friend, and you're doing your part to establish what he calls a kingdom of ends. In other words, a realm in which we will acknowledge others as ends in themselves, entitled to the same dignity that we are. Free as regards all laws of physical nature and obeying only those which he gives himself. There's a lot there. I don't even want to get into that, right? By which his maxims can belong to a system of universal law, to which at the same time he submits himself. This is huge, right? The system of universal law is something that, in a sense, I'm just recognizing. Its consistency, its reason, itself, really. However, I am also choosing to submit myself to this law. I'm recognizing it and submitting to it. And this is what's weird, right? This is autonomy then, right? Autonomy then is the basis of the dignity of human and every rational nature. I freely choose to form maxims as part of a system of universal law. That is, I'm going to autonomously, my autonomy is recognizing universal laws and forming maxims in accordance with those laws. And that's what autonomy is. Autonomy is not obstinacy. It's not me willfully making an exception, treating myself as special in regards to everyone else. So I want us to think in closing here what Kant might mean by a kingdom of ends, right? He said we should never treat anyone else as merely a means. And I think, if nothing else, that's what he's talking about here. Can we imagine a world in which no one is treated merely as a means? We're still not there. Plenty of people are treated merely as a means today, right? Sweatshop labor, any form of undignified labor is going to be an example of this. Why do you think autonomy is so important for Kant? Here. Okay, I'm going to let that suffice for today's video lecture, and I hope this has been somewhat helpful. I will see you again soon to talk about our next Enlightenment thinker. Take care.